We have some millennials in the room, just in case. We were rescued by millennial last session. We're going to be talking today about how to support your missionaries throughout the span of their missionary career. And I'm going to start with a model of member care that some of you have maybe seen, because one of the first things to consider is who does the caring. Now, in this context, we have probably, let me just get a sense of who's in the room. How many of you are here because primarily because you are friends with or related to a missionary and you'd like to just know more about that? Okay, how many are here because you're part of a church missions support team? A lot of you. How many are part of a mission board? Okay, and other things that I missed?
I'm with an organization, and
Okay.
so providing member care.
A member care organization. Oh, great, you're going to be on the list too. Okay, so when we look at missionary care, you guys are, we're talking about how you can provide it, but you may be different depending on who you are and what your background is. So Kelly O'Donnell, who's kind of the member care guy, created this model, which is practically impossible to see. So I'm just going to look at it really quick and kind of point out things. So he talks about that there's care that's provided in different spheres. Are any of you familiar with this? Some of you. This PowerPoint will be online, so you can look at it later.
Turn off at night.
Yeah, let's maybe just for a minute. Could someone just turn off the light and then we'll turn it back on because people are taking notes and it gets really dark in here when the light's off. But you can at least you can see this better. The other slides won't be so hard to see. But at first he says there's master care, that God does care, member care. God cares for his people. And so some things that are member care issues are things that really the missionaries need to be turning to the Lord because he's the one who's going to be able to meet that need. Then there's self-care in this next thing. Sometimes we need to be equipping our missionaries to care for themselves and to do good self-care. Then there's mutual care, and that's friends or colleagues, people that are peers to them somehow. Some of you may fall into this category. And then there's the sender care. That would be either the sending church or the sending mission organization, where they provide member care for their missionary families, or singles. And then there's specialist care, and it's hard to read around here, but he has different things that would be specialty care. Things like, medical care or care for like children's education, team building and interpersonal skills trainings. I can't read it from the angle that I'm at. Crisis response, counseling for different counseling issues. And the idea is that there are certain things that maybe the mission agency or the church sender doesn't have the resources themselves to do, but they can have those resources available. And then there's the network care. That's people who are involved in member care networks, where they're specifically tasked with caring for missionaries across the spectrum and from different organizations. They're not one particular agency, sending agency. Could we hit the lights again? I think that the rest of these will be easier to read, and people are trying to write stuff down, and it's hard to do that in the dark. So just with that in mind, I just want to kind of give that as a parameter, because I think sometimes it's easy to think, that we've got to cover everything. Whoever we happens to be, we've got to cover everything. And the reality, or the agency has to cover everything. Someone else should be doing that. But recognizing that there's kind of a structure, and the idea is that we in the body of Christ all cooperate with one another to be able to provide care so that God's ministry and God's purposes can be accomplished in spreading the gospel. So in light with that, we're going to talk kind of about what you used to call the flow of care. What kind of care do missionaries need at different points of their missionary service? So we'll start at the beginning, logical place, which is pre-field, before they actually go overseas for the first time. What I've done is I've put these slides together is instead of going through the transition model that I like, it's created by Dave Pollock, the late Dave Pollock, who wrote the book on third culture kids, missionary kids. But he talks about the engagement stage was where you start. It's where you've been somewhere for a long time. And at that point, you have relationships that you've built. You feel like you belong somewhere with certain people. You kind of know where you fit with everybody. You have status. It may be high or low, but you know what it is. When you get ready to go into a new stage of life or a new place, you enter the leaving stage. So missionaries, when they're pre-field and they're getting ready to go overseas, are kind of in this stage. And the focus of this stage is you're trying to kind of focus on the immediate future. What do I need to get done so that I can get to the field? There's a lot of celebration as they get ready to go, and there's also a lot of grief and sorrow because they're getting ready to say goodbyes. And so I'm not going to go into all the details of the transition stages. I can put a handout on the website. But I want to touch base with you on that because I think sometimes that can be a relevant piece of the puzzle as we look at this. The focus in this stage is usually on support team building and preparing to leave the field. So whatever other things that need to happen, whether that be figuring out how to ship stuff over or how to sell all their belongings or how to sell the house or find a new home for the dog or whatever the case may be. That's kind of the primary focus during that stage. I think this one I'm mostly going to just talk about how to help and not do all the details of that. So, how can you help? Pre-field training. Those of you who are from sending organizations or in some kind of a member care field, this may be something that you actually provide yourselves. If you are not, if you are a friend or if you are part of a church board but the missionary is going with someone else, it may be something then that you advocate for them to receive. Pre-field training makes an enormous difference. I didn't grab the statistic in front of me, so I don't have it in front of me. But there's a substantial difference, like in the 50% range or something like that, for the number of missionaries who. Oh, actually, I remember what it was. It was the 90% of missionaries who leave the field early are leaving for purposes that would somehow have been covered or addressed in a pre-field training. That if the pre-field training had happened and was more thorough, it could potentially prevent up to 90% of attrition. Now, in reality, there's other factors that go into that, but I thought that was kind of an interesting thing to realize. So pre-field training basically needs to cover some cross-cultural experience and preparations. It needs to cover team issues, because one of the major reasons that missionaries leave the field is because they can't get along with each other. We'd like to think that missionaries are all super holy and they don't have any of those problems, but the reality is that missionaries are human. And as my dad used to say, to live above with the saints we love, well, that will be glory. But to live below with the saints we know, now that's a different story. And the reality is that team relationships can really trip missionaries up. So that needs to be something that's addressed in pre-field training. Sometimes pre-field training may include some language learning preparation, either the actual language learning or training in how to learn languages to kind of equip them to kind of get into that quickly. I can talk more about pre-field training. If you want to ask me more questions, you can come up after, but it should happen. Missionaries going to the field need pre-field training. A second way is to offer practical help. And, depending on, again, the people who are doing the pre-field training are probably not going to be doing a lot of the practical help and vice versa. But recognizing that missionaries are going to need help with things like finding a moving company that can help them move, or some of the things I mentioned before, a realtor to sell a house, or maybe a place to live because they've sold their house and now they don't leave for the field yet, they're not fully supported. Help with getting connected. Let me see what I have on here. Yeah. Help with getting connected with potential supporters and support team building. Emotional support, and I think I have some categories. As I mentioned, there's a lot of mixed feelings because you've got the celebration and you've got the sorrow. Some people are pre-grievers. They grieve before they leave. And those people are going to recognize that they need emotional support. There are going to be other people who are post-grievers. They grieve after they leave. So as they're getting ready to leave, they're feeling great. Have you guys ever thought about that before? How many of you are pre-grievers? I am. How many of you are post-grievers? You ever think about the fact that that can cause conflict in friendships when you have people who are different in that? I'm a pre-griever. I have a friend who's a post-griever. We were getting ready to move to separate places, and I wanted to spend as much time with her as I possibly could, and she was like, and I was constantly, oh, I just am going to miss our friendship so much, and she's like, we're still together, why are you so sad? and I was so frustrated because she was off doing fun stuff and, didn't want to spend that time and give those affirmations, and then we left, and she's writing me letters going, I miss you so much, and I'm like, sorry, sucks to be you. but that conflict, encourage people to say goodbye well. Are any of you familiar with RAFT? If so, bear with me. This is a model that was developed by Dave Pollack, who was with Interaction International, worked with missionary kids, and that's my job too, so I use a lot of stuff from him. But he developed this acronym as a model of how to say goodbye well. And the first is reconciliation. Now that's not a surprise to any of us as believers. The Bible talks about being quick to forgive and keeping short accounts with people. But research tells us that people who move when they haven't resolved conflicts and they leave unresolved conflicts behind them when they move cross-culturally have a hard time adjusting cross-culturally. Not a surprise that God was right. But a lot of times it's tempting if you have a conflict with someone and you're a missionary getting ready to leave for the field, you think, well, if I just ignore it, we're not going to be in the same place, it doesn't matter, I don't need to deal with it, I'll just leave. And that's a really bad practice. So encourage your missionary candidate friends and potential prospective employees to do a good job with reconciliation. Say sorry when you need to, ask forgiveness when you need to, offer forgiveness when you need to. Affirmation. This is the one that we often do when people leave. We give a lot of affirmation, say, really appreciate your friendship, it's been so great knowing you. But affirming relationships is valuable. If you leave and you don't, you leave also unfinished business in a different way. I had a friend that in college who was one of my really close friends, and as I was getting ready to move, I did this. I knew this model, and he and I ended up talking on the phone, and I was telling him, I was looking back at notes that we'd written back and forth in college just to encourage one another and just let him know that I just really appreciated the friendship that he had shown me, especially when I was a missionary kid coming through transition and culture shock and was really struggling. There were times where he had just been a really good friend to me. And I left, and 2 weeks later he was killed in a car accident. And it was really devastating. This is the first time I'd had a close peer friend who'd been killed. I was still young at the time. But as I cried and thought through, the thing that you always think is, if I could just have 5 more minutes, what would I say? And I thought, I don't have anything to tell him that I haven't already told him. And it wasn't that I stopped grieving at that point, but it was so much easier to grieve without regrets. And the reality is that missionaries who move are going to grieve, and they want to grieve without regrets. And yes, you can affirm people after the fact, and we'll talk about that at the very end, how you can encourage them to go back and do that if necessary. You can go back and reconcile after the fact, but it's a lot easier to do it beforehand, and it's not causing problems. Farewells, saying goodbye well. There are people who have a tendency, because they don't want to deal with the goodbyes and the sadness, and they don't want people to cry, they just kind of sneak away. I've heard of people who, they tell people they're leaving on Thursday, and they actually leave on Wednesday, so they don't have to deal with the goodbyes. It's not good practice. And especially it's not good practice if you have missionary families. It's terrible practice for the children to learn that. And so really encourage good goodbyes and good farewells. And if you're in a church setting and you can facilitate the big group goodbyes, that's always helpful too, because sometimes it's really hard for missionaries to get around to everybody individually. But encourage them to choose, help them to kind of think through, who do you need to say goodbye to in a more personal setting, and who can you say goodbye to in a bigger setting, and how can I help to facilitate? Think destination. This has to do with expectations. Expectations are a huge thing that trip people up, because when you go overseas and you expect one thing and you get something different, that creates worse culture shock and all sorts of problems. So we encourage people, make your expectations positive, because If you're looking for the good, you're more likely to find it than if you're looking for the bad. And also make them realistic. It's not this or this, it's both. They need to be positive and realistic. Realistic says there are going to be some hard things. Realistic says, I went through pre-field training and I know that I'm going to have culture shock and I'm going to feel some really unpleasant emotions in the next couple of years. I know that there are going to be times when I am just really, really struggling. I know that there are going to be times when I'm under spiritual attack. And I know that I have a God who will get me through it. And I know that I have these resources. And I know that there are going to be things that make that totally worthwhile in the end. But it's balancing those two things. This isn't on here, but that kind of brings me to something that is a really valuable thing to be able to communicate when you interact with missionaries, and that is to talk about the significance and the truth of paradox. I think as human beings, we don't like paradox very much. Paradox is when two things that are opposite are both true at the same time. We don't like paradox. We like things to be all one way or all the other. If you think about all the political rhetoric today, I'll get myself into trouble here, but it's people are all good or all bad, and it doesn't, whichever side you're on, the other side is bad and your side is good. But it's hard for people to have those nuances of people who can be both good and bad at the same time. They have good characteristics and bad characteristics. Life is like that. If you think about the fact that God is paradox, we shouldn't be surprised. God is eternally angry with sinners, and he's eternally merciful. He's eternally joyful, and he's eternally grieving over the lost. He's constantly content in his own company, and he longs for a relationship with us. Those things are all part of God, and yet they're opposite of each other. I think sometimes, when I start really digging into the lost and the lost world, and I think I'll pray to God, how can you stand it? How can you stand the pain of being consciously aware of that all the time and longing for those people and knowing that they won't come to you? And at the same time I realize, well, God is constantly grieving in a way that I can't even begin to tolerate. He's never in despair. He's always joyful. And he's content and complete. And so when our world has those paradoxes of this really, really hurts and this is really worth it, that shouldn't surprise us. And for missionary children, that's who I work with, and we stress this a lot because the missionary kid life has wonderful blessings and richness and really, really hard things that go with them. And Missionary Training Institute in Colorado has developed a way to communicate paradox to kids. They talk about a pair of ducks. I didn't bring my pair of ducks today, but they have two little rubber ducks. And there's yay duck and there's yuck duck. And they come as a deal. They come as a package deal. And if you want yay duck, you get yuck duck too. And if you don't want yay duck, or you don't want yuck duck, you can't have yay duck either. And that's the reality of life for all of us. So having that as something that you've really internalized and are able to communicate is a really, really valuable thing for missionaries and their families. The last thing on this kind of ties in as well. It's hard to see at the very bottom, but give them permission to grieve. One of the things that missionary kids lack on a regular basis, and I believe that missionary adults do as well, is permission to grieve when they need to. It's the celebration. We have to be excited. We're excited to send you. We're excited for what's coming. And when they're leaving, maybe there's somebody who's grieving with them, but a lot of times it's the excitement gets drowned, the sorrow gets drowned out in the excitement. And that actually makes the transition stage harder when they haven't had a chance to do the grieving ahead of time. Okay. Questions? Thoughts? Okay, moving right along. First year overseas. Well, first year is really the first couple. This is the transition stage of the transition process. It's kind of the heart of the changes, and the word that defines it best is chaos. You've left everything that was familiar and all the routines and the places that you knew and the people that you knew, and now you're in this place where you don't have a structure and you don't know the language and you don't know the culture and you don't know the people and nobody knows you, nobody knows where you fit, and you're a complete unknown, and you're trying to make a new life. And what happens a lot of times is that people who are in this stage get really whiny sometimes. No, it's a really difficult place to be, and it doesn't usually hit right away. We'll talk about that in a second. But when people are in transition, a lot of times you'll find that they get kind of self-focused, and people who are not normally, critical or self-centered people seem to be just, focused on their own needs and their own selves, and basically everybody is just going, I just need to survive this. I can't even worry about how anyone else is going to survive. I've just got to get through this myself. The interesting thing with this is that I've seen this happen in organizations too. Our organization went through a leadership change about a decade ago, and this was going on. There were a whole bunch of other transitions that happened at the same time. We ended up with a lot of tech changes where we were changing email addresses and changing how we were doing a lot of our account stuff. And anyway, so there was just a lot of change that hit people at once, and they were going through this transition. And lo and behold, all these missionaries who had seemed to be, such gracious, godly people were getting so whiny, and everybody was complaining, and we got together and we just griped and complained and whined about all these changes and how hard they were, and we didn't like it, and we just wished we could go back to the old way. And I listened to this, and at the end of a conference actually, and I listened to it, and at the end of the weekend I thought, I think I recognize this. This is what I was saying when I first moved to the States and I was going through culture shock. So you may find that this is something that you encounter outside of the missionary world too. Yeah.
Does this affect singles and families equally or differently?
It affects both. The challenge with families, a single is going to go through it, and they're going to go through it and be them. The challenge with families is that if everybody's going through it, they may be going through it at different paces. In fact, I'm going to bring up the next slide because it'll show, it doesn't, focuses on language learning and cultural adjustments when they're in this stage. Educate yourself about culture shock and transition, and this is just one of the models of culture stress. But people may be in different places in a family. And so one person may still be everything is fun and tremendous, and I'm loving it and having a great time. And the next family member is down here somewhere. And so that can complicate things when family members are going through that transition phase that they may not match. And so it's also important to communicate to families. The reason I say educate yourselves about transition and culture shock is because missionaries hopefully will have heard this at pre-field training. Here's my observation. It doesn't matter how much you tell people before something happens, they don't take it in. They don't have the hooks to hang the information on. And so you tell them this, and then, 8 months later, they're on the field, they're about 4 months in, and they're going, I just can't, and you're like, remember how we talked about? So the value for all of you who interact with them is that you can listen for that. We'll talk about that in a second. But when you're familiar with this, you can be that extra voice to say, remember back at pre-field training when you talked about how... So for those of you who can't read this easily, I'll put this on the website too, but we'll see the PowerPoint. The fun stage, the honeymoon stage, things are similar or satisfying. It's kind of everything is novel and exciting. And there are people who say they go through culture shock on a short-term missions trip. My father, who was a missionary for his entire life, would say that doesn't really happen very much. You may have a little bit of a moment of, but he said real culture shock sets in when you've been there and the novelty has worn off and there is no end in sight. Like, you're here for the long haul and this is where you're stuck, and because that's where it really sets in a big way. So flight is the, different and alarming, and people sometimes do get here in the short-term things. But that idea of, this is just different and bad, this is different and stupid, these people are so dumb, I hate this place, what am I even doing here? That tends to happen a little further on, and then you may go back and forth a little bit between those. Eventually, though, and you notice that this is how happy you are, you start out really happy, and you get a lot less happy, But the longer you go on, this is length of stay, the longer you go on, the more you get to the point where you say, I guess this place is okay. I can deal with this. And then eventually you go, I actually understand why they do that now. That actually makes sense. And eventually, the goal is to get to the point where you recognize that it's the creativity stage, where it's different, but it's open to transaction. Because none of us are just there to learn a culture and completely be absorbed into it. All of us, because we're citizens of a different place, all of us are called to be transformational agents of culture, wherever that is, whether it's in the States or somewhere else. And so the goal is to be an influence for good, where you understand it deeply, and yet you are willing to look to ways to transform it. So once you understand some of those things, offer emotional support and perspective. That may be done through actual conversations. It may be done, last session we talked about, emailing and writing and kind of communicating in a written form. Maybe that's visits. If you're from an organization, it may be something where you read their prayer letters and you say, let's connect them with somebody, but I'll talk about that in a minute. Learn what not to say. One of the things that's really challenging, I'm not going to go into all the details of things that, missionaries go through, but I'll just use an example. America tends to be quite private, and I talked about that last session as well, but, you go overseas and suddenly you're in this place where you have no privacy. And maybe you're living with a family if you're single, and you're trying to figure out this culture, and you don't speak the language, and so you don't even know quite how to communicate what you need. Whether it's because people just drop by in this place and, don't knock, but just come in, or whether it's because, as my mom used to say, Grace the neighbor sat and watched me feed my baby. But apparently our neighbor, where we first were in Singapore, was quite fascinated with how my mom let her, I don't know how old Lisa was, my sister was at the time, but, less than a toddler, feed herself. And finally asked my mom, how do you get her to eat by herself? Because she would sit and feed her 5-year-old, hand feed her, so. But, the neighbor peering in our windows every mealtime watching how we were eating. Or maybe it's because the house guest that came and stayed with you used your toothbrush, and you didn't know that was quite part of the deal when you offered accommodations. But there's those kinds of things that happen. And if you're in the middle of culture shock, those things will send you over the edge. And for somebody to start out by saying, well, it's just so great that you're there, and, God is really going to use you, and, wow, we just look up to you. I could never do what you're doing. If you want to know what not to say, just Google search. There's a lot of blogs about this. All of those things can be true, but the moment, choose the moment. It's true that God is going to use this. It's true that this is going to be. It's the both and that's why I say paradox. Because what happens is, a lot of times, the people that are struggling with the yuck duck, people try to cheer them up with the yay duck. And that's not usually helpful right at that moment. What they really need is someone to acknowledge that yeah, this is really yucky. This is really hard. It will get better, and it's really hard. Both of those things are true. Yeah.
Are there any things that you do when talking to someone who's been whiny that helps you have empathy for them? Or any things that you think about, or just to help you pause?
What I often will try to do is listen to what's underneath, and instead of responding to all of the whininess or all the complaints, I'll try to take the bigger picture and look and say, it sounds like you're really feeling discontent right now. Things are really overwhelming right now. And I'll try to reflect back some of that bigger picture, because I think sometimes people don't even realize that themselves. This isn't even just in a missionary context. This isn't in any context. Right. When people are feeling those things and they're kind of spouting out, they don't even recognize what's behind it sometimes. So helping to formulate that. And then there are times when I will say, I kind of remember, when I was reading about culture shock, wow, this sounds kind of like that. Do you remember? Just what do you think? Might that fit? And I'll approach it in a kind of a wondering way. And it depends on the person, of course. Sometimes you can just say, wow, I think you have culture shock. I think that's what you're feeling is because of culture shock. But different people will be different. But drawing their attention back, but acknowledging first, and not trying to put them up on a pedestal. One of the dangers of putting people on a pedestal before they leave is that they get over there and suddenly they aren't special anymore, and that adds to the culture shock. And if you keep them on the pedestal, that's just a recipe for missionaries to go through burnout, because they're trying to hide all their problems so they can live up to your expectations, whether you're the mission board or the church or the friend. Avoiding the pedestal is helpful. This is kind of relevant, Pierce, and I didn't have it in my presentation, but I'm going to say it because I say it every time I speak. Related to this, learn the difference between encouragement and comforts. Comforts and encouragement are often used interchangeably, but they're not at all the same thing. Comfort is where you start when somebody is struggling. Comfort says, wow, I hear you, and it's really hard, and I'm just here. I'm just going to be here. I'm going to listen, I'm going to sit with you, I'm going to be quiet with you, and I'll just let you process what you need to process. And maybe we'll do that out loud, maybe we'll do that not out loud. But it's okay. Encouragement says, have you ever thought about it from this angle? There's this other perspective that you may want to consider. And encouragement basically is trying to make somebody feel better by changing the way they look at it. Comfort just sits with them and feels it with them. And the reality is that comfort does make them feel better too. But the intention when you sit with someone is just to be there with them. I say a lot of times when I speak about missionary kids get a lot of encouragement and not nearly enough comfort. When they get ready to move and they're going to leave all their friends, and you think about how we talk to kids, and the kid says, I don't want to move, I'm not going to have any friends in a new place. And the mom and dad don't want their child to feel sad, and the mom and dad have a bigger perspective. They know the kid is going to have friends. This is like the most outgoing child in the whole world. They say, oh, honey, you're going to have great friends. You're probably going to have better friends in here. Remember when you moved here, you thought you weren't going to have any friends, and the next day you met so-and-so. This is a lot like going to a funeral and a woman is standing next to her husband's casket and you say, oh, honey, God's going to give you a better husband next time and he's going to be even better than the last one. We would never do that, right? Like, can you imagine someone walking up to a widow? That's true. There's always that one. But the reality is we talk to children that way all the time. And we talk to adults that way sometimes too. Not necessarily with that topic, but recognizing that encouragement follows comfort. Comfort first, and then encouragement. Because when you've been comforted, you're ready to hear the encouragement. But if you start with encouragement, it just shuts people off because they feel like you don't get it. Okay. Listen for red flags. I'm going to put this, I meant to have this as a handout and my printer was having issues this morning, so I don't. So I'm just going to show you this and you can look at the handout on the internet, or you can look at the flags on here. The handout has a little bit more in it than this, but these are some things, this is also from Missionary Training Institute or adapted from them, that they had come up with as, the kinds of statements that people may say when they're in the throes of culture shock. I look, they're years behind us, they're so uncivilized, they're so inconsiderate. Everything here is so expensive, everybody's critical, nobody cares, everybody's dirty and rude, and they use my toothbrush. And that really did happen at our house, by the way. That's not a made-up story. But if you're interacting with missionaries, and especially those first couple of years, and you're hearing these kinds of things, your radar should go up. Like, I remember hearing something about this. And that's, again, where you can kind of tie it back to, wow, these things sound an awful lot like you might be going through culture shock. So when you familiarize yourself with culture shock and listen well and hear red flags, then the next thing is, we talked about offering emotional support. But you may also need to connect them with some resources. And that may be a member care organization. It may be somebody who's in the mission organization that specializes in member care. Maybe it's connecting them with some practical resources. Maybe they need some counseling. But somebody who can help with some of those things if that doesn't seem to resolve. Questions, thoughts? Let me just back up 1 second and say, if missionaries have realistic expectations, that will help a lot. But one of the challenges is that you can never predict everything. So missionaries can't ever have completely realistic expectations because there's just so many things that you just don't know until you get there. One of the things that really struck me was an article written by actually Dave Pollock's son, Mike, who's a friend of mine. He wrote about when they moved to China, and he said, the thing that was so hard was after about a year or year and a half, he said, I felt like I had done so much to try to accommodate myself to them. He said he was a missionary kid, grown up overseas. He said, I thought I wasn't going to have any trouble with culture shock. I thought I pretty much knew what my expectations needed to be. I was pretty, savvy with this. But he said, what caught me off guard was I'd done so much to accommodate myself, and they weren't doing anything to accommodate to me. He said, here I'm trying so hard to speak their language and to pay attention to the way they do things and to do things right and to not mess up and to not offend anybody. And, you'd think that they could just, at least come a little bit towards me and try to, maybe feed me Western food every once in a while. But no, they just looked at me like, great, you're starting to come along finally, a little bit. You're finally starting to figure out how life is supposed to be. And sometimes, it's those things that even if you have really good skills cross-culturally and good training, there's always going to be something that will trip you up. And so that's where, having the people who will help you and support you in the middle of that is helpful. Home assignment focuses on reconnecting with supporters and families. This is hopefully going to happen after they have gotten through the worst of the U-curve or on the upswing again. Ways to help. Encourage good timing. The reason that we suggest in our organization that people not come home before 2 years is because they're still coming home. Home is not overseas yet. And so it makes it really, really challenging when you come home in the middle of that U-curve tends to take between 1 year and 2 years. And if you go back when you're, in the first year and you're right at the bottom of that, going back to the field is just horrific. Because you haven't established, you haven't come out of it and started to enjoy it yet. It doesn't feel like home yet. So give them a couple of years to get through that and start to be on the upswing at least. So that they have something that they feel like, this is what we're going back to. So if you're somebody who has input on what timing they choose for their home assignments, that's a good one. You may, if you're a mission organization or somebody who specializes in this, you may want to have a discussion on whether they want to do a 2 year and 2 years and a summer, or the 4 year and a year home assignment schedules. Are you familiar with those? People who've been in missions have usually seen both. But we used to stay on the field for 4 years and we'd come back to the States for a year. Now it's more common for people to go for 2 years, come back for a summer. Both things have pluses and minuses, and so if you're someone who has some say in that, whether that be because you have personal conversations with them, you have a lot of flexibility, or because you're their organization, familiarize yourself with what are the strengths and weaknesses of both, because it may be that certain people have, like a certain situation, you would want to say, this seems like it's time for you to do the 4 year, 1 year, versus I think that the 2 year summer would actually work better for you right now. If you want to have that conversation, I can talk to you more about it later. Provide logistical support. This is the one we usually think of, especially if you're at church. Looking for housing. We have 2 missionary families coming back from our church this summer, and we're looking for a place for them to live, vehicles for them to use. If they're coming back for a year, they may need household stuff. They may need rides to the airport. So those kinds of things can be really helpful. Facilitate opportunities for them to share. One of the things that has been really, if you get missionaries together, they do gripe a little bit among themselves sometimes with the changes in how churches have missionaries share. And it used to be that, a missionary would come and they'd have the service and they'd be able to share, especially when you're gone for 4 years. You've got 4 years of your life where you put your heart and soul into investing into some ministry and hopefully seeing the results. If not seeing the results, you need even more to be able to share and process. And, you come in and you kind of go, well, you have 5 minutes to say everything that's happened in the last 3 years. Larry Gardner, who's been the speaker here, has a story in her book that she has upstairs, where they had devoted their lifetimes to a translation of the New Testament and the supporting Old Testament passages. And they came back to their home church after leaving the field, and they wanted to present a copy of this life work to the church. And the church said, "You can do that if you can do that in about 3 minutes, that would be great." It's painful to missionaries to have the churches that are supposed to be their support team, the ones who are holding the line as they're going into the hard place, and these are the people who are standing behind them and saying, "We've got your back. We're going to make sure that you're covered when you go into those hard situations, those hard places to minister." When it seems like those people don't care at all. So if you're part of a church, it doesn't mean you have to give the missionary the whole service, but have a conversation about, is there a way that we could let you share, maybe in a different venue if the services are different.
Things like that could happen when the support team in that church isn't necessarily involved in what's going to happen when they come back to the church. Like if there's the platform chair that day and they don't really know anything about them, and they're going to say, "I've got whatever, so you get
Right.
that." And that is something that person doesn't know what they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
And so that means somebody has to be paying attention
Yes.
to when they come back and how that's going to happen, and to be able to orchestrate it. So
Right.
it's a positive thing.
That facilitating is a really key word there. Yeah, you're absolutely right, because I don't think it's malicious at all. I don't think that's at all the intention. I think, especially, with the U.S. being so time-oriented, people are, chop, time for church to be over. And,
You're right. That's the obstacle out, because otherwise that will happen.
mm-hmm. It can happen all the time. One of the most encouraging things, though, that one of my supporting churches did, I went for their missions conference, and they had, I didn't share in the service at all. They had another person who gave the sermon, and, different people did different things, but they had a Sunday school hour, combined adult Sunday school hour, and they had a panel of us, and we all shared. And then they had home meetings, and they had us go, and at the home meeting, it was people who cared about my ministry, who were interested in what I was doing and interested in hearing and participating. And they asked questions, and they, had obviously read my prayer letters, and they prayed for me. They went around afterwards, and they all prayed for me, and it was one of the most encouraging experiences I've ever had. So, churches can really minister and like, if you kind of think, okay, I've gone through this really hard term and I'm kind of coming through, and churches can really help to buoy missionaries' spirits up and prepare them to go back. I was looking at, in Luke 9, when Jesus sent out the disciples and send them out to minister, and remember go into a town, and if they don't accept you, kick the dust at them. But when they came back, it said there were 3 things that were part of them coming back. One of them was, I'll look at my notes on this actually. The first one was that they return and tell what happened and share everything that happened. And so the people returned, the disciples, remember, they were all excited. Even the demons submitted to us. And they were all excited about it. And Jesus listened to them. And he let them tell what experiences they'd had and share that. And then the next thing was, he said, and this is actually leading into my next point, the next thing was he told them, come away to a quiet place and let's have some rest. And oh, sorry, it's not my next thing. Asking good questions and listening well. This is kind of the debriefing piece, the piece of, letting them talk and share in other venues, but also talk and share with you. Helping them to be able to process out loud the experience they've had. Oops, wrong thing. And then help them find some Sabbath time. Because the next thing Jesus did was he gave his disciples, the 70 or whoever they were that went out, he gave them Sabbath time and said, come away and let's have a rest. And then he prayed for them. And Jesus prayed and thanked God for the things that had been accomplished. And that idea of blessing, listening, resting and blessing them is really powerful. And then again, connect them with resources. Missionaries coming back for home assignment may have specific needs that they need to cover when they're here. Maybe it's raising more support, and you have an opportunity to connect them with someone who may be interested in their ministry. Maybe it's they need a child tested for special needs, or they need to do some academic testing because they're homeschooling and they need to show what grades their child has accomplished. Maybe they need to do some college visits if they have older kids. Maybe they need to go shopping because they have to take a bunch of supplies back because they don't have certain things overseas and they have to ship things back with them. So, connecting with resources may look really different. Okay, ongoing service. I'll have to power through this. Ongoing service, they're back in the engagement stage. They're back settled in the new place through the U-curve and pursuing ministry opportunities and managing ongoing life transitions, because the reality is that we all go through transitions at different points in our lives, just developmental transitions from childhood to teenagerhood to adulthood to, if you have kids, having kids of different ages. Life transitions, let me just say a word about that in light of my session on singles and marrieds together. Life transitions look different, whether if it's a married couple than it does if you're a single. Singles who are young tend to be going through early life thinking, eventually when I get married. And at some point they will start to realize that may not be a possibility, or that may not happen for me. For me, I'm single and never been married, and that happened when I was in my 30s. Or kind of early 30s, and really wrestled with that. And so that became a transition for me. The time where I was looking for a spouse and the time when I had kind of made peace with, I believe God has my best interest at heart no matter whether he gives me a spouse or not. That was a really significant transition for me. But recognizing that there are transitions in single life, not just in married life where you have no kids and then you have kids and on. That would be true for couples who don't have children as well. Okay, maintain a relationship through ongoing communication. Maybe even visit them. Lots of opportunities for communicating nowadays, especially as you have a personal relationship with the missionaries. They would appreciate that. We talked in last session about when you communicate with them, it's really appreciated when you write and say, I wanted you to know I'm praying for you, I'm thinking of you, but don't feel like you need to write back. that permission not to have that, I've got to email so and so back hanging over their heads is really appreciated. Learn more about third culture kids. If you have missionary families who have children, and you want to be involved in their lives and invest in that family, it's really valuable and I would almost say essential to understand the concept of third culture kids. Are you familiar with that? Third culture kids, the basic premise is that everybody has a first culture. That's the culture where you have citizenship, except for very rare circumstances like in the movie The Terminal. But generally, everybody has a citizenship. So that's the place, your legal culture, where they have to take you in because you belong to them. Everybody has a second culture. That's where you live, the geographic culture. But when those two things don't match, you end up with a third culture. And the third culture is not based on your citizenship or based on where you live. It's shared with other people who have the same experience of having those two things not match. And so if you're familiar at all with the term, it's the expat culture for the most part. It's a community unto itself. And if you've ever lived overseas in an expat community or you've visited, you've seen what that looks like. It's involved with the local community, but not completely. They're not insiders, but it's not completely outsider either. And third culture kids, yeah.
Is that like a school for missionary children?
A missionary kids school would be a really prime example of heavy-duty third culture. Because a lot of times it has multiple people from multiple places there too, and teachers from multiple places. The reality is all of our missionaries are third culture people after they've been overseas for a period of time. That doesn't even change when they move back, but they're third culture immigrants. And immigrants are affected by their culture. They couldn't, after 20 years in a place, move back to their original place and fit right in. They'd struggle and go through culture shock as well. But third culture the kids are third culture natives. And so they grow up reflecting the value system and the thought patterns of that culture a lot more closely than the adults who had a value system and thought pattern and belief system in place before they moved in the first place. There's a book called Third Culture Kids in the back, and it talks about the different things that affect and influence the value systems and the beliefs and the kind of the worldview of third culture kids. One is mobility. The expat community is highly mobile. So third culture kids, they say a lot of times that the average third culture kid moves 8 times moves 8 times before they're 18. The average American moves 11 times in their lifetime. And that's the average. There are third culture kids in the not missionary community, but in the business community, especially the military and embassy communities, which are also part of that third culture world, where they move every 1 to 2 years. So the problem is, even if you don't move, your friends move. So at one point, I counted up the number of best friends I'd had in my life, and I think it was somewhere in the 30s or 40s. And I was an introvert who had typically 1 to 2 best friends at a time, but they kept moving, or I kept moving. And so there's this constant turnover. My high school that I went to, I didn't graduate from it, but the high school I went to starting in 9th and 10th grade, had about 100 kids in my class. My senior year, 10 of them were left. It was a 90% turnover in 4 years. So the reality of saying goodbyes over and over again, and the grief that goes with that. Remember I talked about permission to grieve. Missionary kids have a tremendous amount of grief. It's not usually grief from somebody dying. It's just grief from the fact that you have these constant recurring losses. You never get over the first one before you have the next one. So that's a huge factor in how they think, how they perceive relationships, how they build relationships, what they expect relationships to look like. The second thing is cross-cultural experience, that they're interacting with multiple cultures, and so they don't have, let's say, the sense of loyalty to one culture, or even really know what culture they feel most comfortable in. So those are.
Who do you root for in the Olympics?
Oh, that is a huge. That's like a topic of discussion among missionary kids, or third culture kids more broadly, or the World Cup, because really, come on. They don't have that problem with like American football usually. A few of them do. They're like, Vikings. Now, is that baseball or football? But yeah, so those things go into third culture life. That is like my mini third culture kid thing. I've done entire sessions on that probably are on the website. I don't know, but I'm guessing if you're interested in hearing about that rather than reading about that, you could go back and watch some of those old sessions from previous conferences. But also the book that is out is really excellent and really comprehensive and has a section for caregivers.
And that book's name is Mobility?
It's on the back. Third Culture Kids.
Oh, okay.
It's by Dave Pollock and Ben Regan. And it's the blue one. I would recommend getting the third edition. There's a lot of new stuff in it, including some stuff that I did. But that's not why. It's just a great book. And cultivating relationships with kids. The reason I say cultivating relationships when the kids are overseas is because a lot of times churches want to minister to missionary kids when the missionary kids come back to the States and they're accessible. But it's really, really hard to get involved with a teenager who's no idea who you are and to initiate a relationship at that point. When I speak about missionary kids, because that's my job, so a lot of times when I'm speaking in churches about my ministry, that's what I talk about. I have people come up to me all the time from different churches saying, I would love to help out. Oh wow, they're in college and they don't have anywhere to go for Thanksgiving because, I've had missionary kids, not my own, because not the ones I work with, but friends of mine from when I was growing up who ended up, alone over Christmas in the dorm or alone over Thanksgiving when the only person in the dorm. And they say, I'd love to be able to help, have people over, or they need somewhere to stay for the summer because they can't go home. Oh yeah, I could provide a room. And I've tried that, but it's really, really difficult to randomly connect. So if you have a family that you know, get to know their kids. Maybe it's on home assignments and you just, you sit down and chat with the little ones, or you take them to, a baseball game or something that's, an activity that they can be involved in, because then they know who you are. And so the people, when I would come back to the States, there were people who, every time I came back, they had invested in me. People from the church who, we came back and they'd take me shopping for one nice outfit so I didn't have to dress from the missionary barrel all the time. It's a different era. But, I remembered them. Of course I knew who they were. And it was a natural thing at that point for me to interact with them. And if they had invited me for Thanksgiving, that would have been an easy choice. Of course I'll go to spend time with you on Thanksgiving. I know you. Receiving their MKs when it's time for college. So getting to know them beforehand prepares you to be able to make a real difference and a huge impact. One of the major reasons that missionaries leave the field is because of their kids, and a very common time for them to leave is when their kids leave for college and they're separated by an ocean from their college-age kids, especially when their kids are struggling. The kids are going to go through that same U-curve coming back to the States, and when mom and dad are far away, that's a really hard thing to watch your kids go through that when you can't be there to help. Connect them with resources. Again, throughout their different missionary career, they'll have different needs for resources. Transition back from the field. This is going to be kind of a repeat, so we're basically done here, but transition stage again. They're going through chaos. They're going through reverse culture shock, so they do that whole U-curve again, and they're trying to reestablish home, because, when you come home, you think home is a place where you know everybody, and people know you, and you know how things work, and you know where everything is. And you come back to the States after being overseas for many years, and you don't know how things work, and nobody really remembers you very well. And the places, the place where your grocery store that you always shopped used to be is now a parking lot, and the bank is now a grocery store, and the things that used to be in aisle 10 are now who knows where, and what are all these new products that I've never heard of? Why do we have hand sanitizer all over? The things that you don't think about, because all those changes happen so gradually for us. But you talk to a missionary, even who comes back after 4 years. The hand sanitizer thing, I noticed these things because of missionaries, but that happened after SARS. Stores started putting hand sanitizer all over the place. The current craze is everything is spicy hot, or buffalo this, or that's like a new trend in the U.S. Somebody who's been away for 3 years is going to go, what on earth happened? But when you have a cumulative, like all these things, it feels just like you're going overseas and you don't know anything again. So all those things that we talked about, providing logistical help just like on home assignment. Offering emotional support, just like those other things. Encouraging raft. If you have a chance to talk to them before they leave, encourage them to say goodbye while overseas. If not, encourage them to do some remedial work. Giving them permission to grieve. This is huge. Because a lot of times, you come back, we always talk about this for missionary kids, but this is true for adults too. You come back, you're coming back permanently, you just left home, you get off the plane, and Grandpa and Grandma greet you, and they say, aren't you glad to be home? We're so glad to see you. And how do you tell Grandpa and Grandma that you aren't glad and you aren't home? You don't want to hurt their feelings. You're glad to see them. But you just left home. And it hurts. And so you don't have permission to grieve, so you just kind of go, yeah, so glad to be here, and you stuff it all down. And you try to put on a happy face. And at some point, that just explodes. And it makes a huge mess when that happens. So it's not that you have to greet them by saying, oh, I'm so sorry you had to leave. but greeting them with, we're so glad you're here. And recognizing that part of the next sentence may be, how are you feeling about being back? And that may change. And you know what? However you're feeling, that's totally okay. And if you feel the same tomorrow, that's okay. And if you feel different, that's okay too. And that's going to be continuing. So I'm going to continue to let you be okay feeling what you're feeling as long as you need to. It's hugely powerful. Asking good questions and listening well, just like before, that debriefing, being able to ask good questions. I actually can put up on the website a handout that I had thought about printing out but didn't, about some good debriefing questions to help people process their experience. Remember what to say and not to say. Refresh your memory on culture shock and watch for red flags. And then eventually, because you can't see it on the bottom, but it does say it, connect them with resources. So all those things that you've been preparing are great things to put into practice when your missionaries return, especially if they're returning at retirement where they've been overseas a long time, or if they're returning not by choice because they are, for whatever reason had to leave the field, whether that's because they were evacuated or because there was a coup or because there was a relational problem or because there was a moral failure or whatever the reason, those permanent, that final leaving the field is the place where all those other things you've been practicing for years, can use them all. So, thank you. Thank you for your patience for a couple minutes.